What happens when the role that made you successful stops feeling like who you really are? What happens when the story you've been living inside begins to crack? And the biggest question becomes, if I'm not that role anymore, then who am I? Welcome to your Passion, Purpose, and Personal Brand. I'm Lisa McGuire, Strategic Identity Advisor who helps experienced professionals turn that lifetime of experience into the next chapter of their career and business. In today's episode, we're going to talk about truth. The kind of truth that shows up when the stories we've trusted start to shift, and the roles we've been performing no longer feel completely aligned. Because sometimes the moment the role stops fitting is the moment your real authority begins to emerge. Let me start with a story. There are moments in history when something subtle but powerful begins to happen. It's not a loud revolution, not a breaking news headline, but a quiet shift in awareness. People begin noticing things they once overlooked. They start sensing the difference between what they were told and what they can now see for themselves. And when that happens, something inside of us wakes up, because truth has a very particular feeling. It's not panic and it's not anger. It's recognition. It's the quiet moment when something inside your body says, I knew something didn't feel right. We're living in one of those moments right now. Stories that once seemed solid are being questioned. Systems that once felt permanent are revealing cracks. And when the light begins to shine into those cracks, we naturally begin asking deeper questions. If this isn't true, then where else have I been believing something that doesn't fully hold? But the most powerful truth that begins to surface during times like these isn't about institutions. It's about identity. Because when the structures around us begin to shift, we inevitably start asking a more personal question. That question surrounds the idea of who am I really? But before we go further, a quick note from today's show sponsor. Today's episode is sponsored by something I'll explain later. It's a framework of something I developed years after working with professionals who reach a moment when the role no longer fits who they are becoming. I call it category of only, and we'll explain what that means in a moment. But first, let me share a story that changed the way I think about truth. Years ago, I was part of an organization where a narrative had been carefully constructed. It wasn't an outright lie, but a version of events that the leadership wanted people to believe. It was designed to maintain stability, to preserve confidence, and to protect the organization. And for a while, it worked, until it didn't. Because eventually something happened that changed the way I will think about truth forever. One day, a representative of this group approached me and told me that there was a select group of individuals that wanted to host a meeting. They were calling it Straight Talk. But before they could hold that meeting, something had to happen first. They had to resign. Every one of them had to step down from their roles inside the organization before they were allowed to speak openly. Now think about that for a moment. The truth could only be spoken once the role was removed, once the title was gone, and once the expectation to protect the narrative no longer existed. And that moment stayed with me for a really long time because it revealed something profound. Sometimes the role we hold is the very thing preventing us from telling the truth. What struck me about that moment wasn't just what people said. It was what happened when roles disappeared. Because when roles disappeared, people began telling the truth. And as I watched that unfold, I found myself wondering, how many people are still holding onto roles that quietly prevent them from telling the truth about who they really are? Not because they're dishonest, but because the role rewards the mask. It rewards the title and the expectations. And that identity is built over years of achievement. And if that role disappeared tomorrow, what truth would finally come out? That question isn't just about organizations. It's about our lives too. So there's a great metaphor for this. Many of us are living on a stage, not in a false way, but in a sense that we've learned how to play a role. It could be a professional role, a leadership role, or even a success role. We learn the lines and we understand the expectations. We discover what the audience responds to. And over time, we become very good at performing the role. But here's the part people rarely talk about. When you stay on the stage long enough, it becomes easy to forget who you are behind that curtain. The role becomes the identity, and the performance becomes the life. And eventually, something inside of you begins asking a quiet question. Who am I when the curtain closes? A question can feel uncomfortable, but it's also the beginning of something very powerful. Because the moment you begin asking that question, you are stepping off the stage. You're beginning to rediscover that person behind the performance. One of the ways I'm wired is to recognize patterns and connections. I can easily see how they form frameworks. So I want to unpack what I'm calling the identity framework. Over the years, I've noticed that people tend to move through 3 stages when you realize there is a person behind the performance. The first stage is the mask. The mask is the identity that help you succeed. It's the title, the role, the expectations you learn to meet well enough to be rewarded. And the mask isn't wrong. It often brings us things like stability and recognition. It's a life that looks successful from the outside, but eventually something begins to feel off. Because the mask may have brought you success, but it was never meant to define who you are. Which leads to the second stage. I call this the truth moment. This is the moment when the role no longer feels like home. Externally, everything still looks successful, but internally, something begins to shift. You start asking questions like, is this really me? Is this the work I want to be known for? Is this the life I've built actually aligned with who I am? And I want to acknowledge that that moment can be unsettling, but it's also incredibly important because when the mask loosens, the truth of who you are is beginning to surface. And that leads to the third stage, the moment when people stop performing the role that defined them and begin building their work around the truth of who they are. I'll give that moment a name later. Before we wrap today, I want to invite you to try something. Just pause for a moment, wherever you are. You don't need to close your eyes. Just notice and ask yourself one simple question. Where in my life am I still performing a role that no longer feels true? Not the role that pays you, not the role that impresses people. Just notice the role that feels a little heavy right now. The one where you feel like you're managing expectations instead of expressing who you really are. Now imagine something. Imagine that role disappeared. The title, the expectations, and the identity attached to it. If none of that existed, what truth about yourself would finally have room to surface? Maybe it's the work you'd actually want to be known for. Maybe it's the voice you've been holding back. Maybe it's a direction you've quietly considered but haven't allowed yourself to pursue. Just notice what comes up, because that quiet signal, that inner knowing, is often the first glimpse of your real identity emerging. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned I use a methodology. Let me explain what I mean by that. Over the years, as I've watched many high-achieving professionals, they arrive exactly at this moment. From the outside, their lives still look successful. The career works, the reputation is strong, the role still commands respect. But internally, something has shifted. The identity that once defined them no longer reflects who they are becoming. And for a long time, I struggled to explain what I was actually helping people do in that moment. I wasn't guiding people to reinvent themselves from scratch. I was leading them to see something that had been there all along. The unique authority they had built over a lifetime, the perspective that no one else could replicate, the work they were uniquely positioned to do next. And eventually, I realized that moment, the moment finally when someone sees that truth about themselves, needed a name. I call it the category of only. Because no one else has lived your career, seen what you've seen, or learned what you have learned. Because every person has something they've built over a lifetime that no one else can replicate. Category of only is the moment when someone recognizes that authority and turns it into the foundation of their next chapter. In many ways, I act as a strategic mirror by seeing patterns in someone else's career, their perspective and identity. They often cannot see themselves. And when those patterns become clear, something powerful happens. Instead of competing inside of someone else's category, they begin defining their own. We are living in a time where the light is shining on so many things: institutions, systems, and stories. And the more clearly we see those things, the more we begin asking a deeper question. What is actually true? But the most important truth you will ever discover isn't about the world. The most important thing you can do for you and your future direction is to discover the truth about yourself. Because when you start with truth, you stop performing, and your real identity begins to surface. And when that happens, your category of only begins. If something in this conversation resonated with you, if you're beginning to sense that the role you've been performing no longer reflects who you are becoming, that's exactly the moment where the work I do begins. Helping people recognize the authority they built over a lifetime and turn it into the next chapter of their career or business. If you're curious about what your category of only might be, you can learn more in the show notes. I'd love to help you see what you may not be able to see yet. And before we close, I want to leave you with one final question to reflect on. Where in your life are you still performing a role that no longer feels true? You don't have to answer that now, but if that question stirred something for you, I'd love to hear what came up. Send me a message or share your reflection. You can always find me on LinkedIn. Sometimes the moment we name the truth is the moment everything begins to change. Thank you so much for being here. And if you liked the episode, please feel free to subscribe to the show, leave a review, and if you're watching on YouTube, click the subscribe button below. And until next time, stay true to who you are becoming. I'll see you back here next week.